Hi guys, and welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 goes over biodiversity, biodiversity loss, and an emerging field in biology known as conservation biology. Now for today, all I want to do is kind of introduce you to the topic of what is biodiversity and how biodiversity is distributed all around the globe. So, biodiversity is broadly defined as the variety or variation across all levels of biological organization. And remember back in Chapter 3 how we talked about studying biology at different scales. We could start at the organismal scale, then we could move up to maybe the scale of a population where we look at multiple individuals in a species. Then, ramping it up a little more, we look at the community level where we look at multiple populations of different species. Looking a little bit broader, we can look at the ecosystem level where we have an interaction between biological communities and abiotic components. And then finally, at the landscape scale, we look at different variations across different communities and different ecosystems at the landscape or biome level. Well, just like how we look at different scales in biology, biodiversity also looks at variation across different biological scales. And instead of going from the ground up, going from the organismal level all the way to the ecosystem level, we're going to start today at the ecosystem level and move our way down to the organismal level. At the largest end of the spectrum, the very broadest scale, we're going to have ecosystem diversity. Ecosystem diversity is biodiversity at the landscape scale, so think in a very broad sense over a very broad area. And this can basically include the number and variety of ecosystems and some of their subcomponents in that given area or that given landscape. So this may include diversity of habitat types, this could be diversity of biological communities, and it could be a combination of the two, where we look at a diversity of ecosystems, basically a variation in the communities in that area, as well as the abiotic components with which those communities interact. Now, in addition to this, ecosystem diversity can also look at the variation in ecological community types within a given landscape. And now I want you to note that that's a little more specific than just a diversity of different communities. For example, if you're walking along the shore of a beach, you might see different types of communities of animals that live in different parts of the beach. However, those are all going to be beach type communities. If you look at a larger landscape, you might see aquatic type communities, you might see terrestrial type communities. Things that would live in a sand dune, for example, would have very different functioning than what would live in the water. So variation in different ecological community types is also something considered within ecosystem diversity. Now, keep in mind that the diversity in ecological community types is more or less a direct function of the number of habitats and the number of ecosystems in a landscape. So all of these are tied together more or less within the scope of ecosystem diversity. And ecosystem diversity also takes into account the size, the shape, and the number of connections between different ecosystems at the landscape scale. So, all else equal, a landscape that is very connected with large amounts of exchange in material, energy, maybe different trophic levels, or different organisms going back and forth between multiple ecosystems is going to be more diverse than a landscape that has very isolated ecosystems that don't really interact with one another. So the size, shapes, patches, and the connections between ecosystems at the landscape scale is important in determining ecosystem biodiversity. And so, focusing a little bit more narrower, now we're looking at specifically one ecosystem. Species diversity is basically the number, variety, and distribution of species within a given ecosystem. Your book only looks at number and variety. I want you to look at distribution, and we're going to give an example of what distributions of species within an ecosystem looks like here in just a second. For now, I also want you to know that speciation, when species split off to become two new species, that increases species diversity, and extinction, when all of the individuals in a species die out, that decreases species diversity within a given ecosystem. But let's look at how the number of species and the distribution of those species impacts biodiversity at the ecosystem perspective. Looking at species diversity, it is dependent on two different factors. richness, which is how many species you have in a given community, and evenness, which is how evenly those species are distributed within that given ecosystem. Now, richness, when it's on its own, is pretty intuitively easy to understand. A richer ecosystem is going to have higher numbers of species, and when you're comparing two different ecosystems, if one has a higher number of species, obviously that ecosystem is going to be more biologically diverse than an ecosystem with fewer numbers of species. But what if the numbers of species within two different ecosystems are the same? Well, that's when we begin to consider something called evenness, which refers to how evenly distributed the different species within an ecosystem is. Now, to better understand differences in evenness among communities that have the same number of individuals and the same number of species, we're going to consider the example on the left-hand side of your screen. Now, in community 1, we have 20 individuals and 4 different species, and these are going to be evenly distributed throughout the community, meaning that within each species, we have 5 individuals from species A, B, C, and D. So, very even distributions of individuals within each species within our community. However, consider the example of community 2. In community 2, we also have 20 individuals and 4 different species within that community. However, the distributions are very skewed. Out of our 20 individuals, 16 individuals are coming from species A, only 1 individual is going to be coming from species B and C, and then 2 individuals are going to come from species D. The distributions in community 2 are going to be very different from the distribution in community 1. And out of the 2, community 1 is far more even because the distributions of individuals within the species are relatively even to one another. This is the difference between evenness, which is the distribution of species, and richness, the number of species in an ecosystem, and both play an integral role in determining the species diversity of a given ecosystem. So for our last example, we're going to hone down our focus even more and look at the number of individuals and the genetic variation of individuals within a single species. So just one species now. And for that, we're going to look at genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the variation in genes or genetics among individuals of a single species in a single population. Now, genetic diversity goes a long way in determining the long-term probability that any one species is going to survive. And to understand this, I want you to think back to Chapter 3 and the drivers of evolution and natural selection. When you have high genetic diversity in a species, for example, that means that there are a lot of different types of mutations and a lot of different types of traits and adaptations within individuals of the same species. So if you have very high genetic diversity, what that means is that there's probably a really good chance that if you have any given change in that environment, there are going to be a few individuals from that species that are going to have the adaptations to cope with it. However, if you have very low genetic diversity, you don't have a lot of variation in traits and you don't have a lot of variation in adaptations. So if a disturbance comes along, there is a much less likely chance that any one individual or individuals in that species will be able to have the adaptations to cope with that change, and so there is a much higher likelihood that species with low genetic diversity are going to die out. And a key component, it should be noted, in genetic diversity of a species is more or less a direct function of how many individuals you have in that species. All else equal, a greater population size of a given species will have greater genetic diversity. And when there are too few numbers of individuals within a species, we run into a problem called inbreeding depression. If you don't have a lot of different individuals in a species, you're going to increase the likelihood of inbreeding. When you inbreed, you dramatically begin to decrease the genetic diversity because everything is going to be related to one another, and so they're all going to get the same genes from their parents as you go from parent to offspring, parent to offspring. What's happening again is that you are dramatically limiting and funneling off the amount of genetic diversity in that population. What happens there is that, again, if you have low genetic diversity, you have fewer and fewer adaptations and you have fewer variation in your adaptations, and so it precipitously begins to increase the probability that that species is going to die out if you have some kind of dramatic disturbance, because you reduce the probability that any one individual will be able to cope with that disturbance. So this is why genetic diversity and having high numbers of individuals within a species is really important in determining that species' probability of long-term survival. Now, for the last slide in this lecture, we're going to look at the distribution of biodiversity around the world because biodiversity is not distributed equally. Species diversity is greatest right around the equator, and for this, I want you to think back to the biomes lecture in Module 1. Remember how we talked about there was a general tendency as you moved from a drier biome to a wetter biome, you increased biodiversity, and as you moved from a colder biome to a hotter biome, you also increased biodiversity. So, all else equal, hotter and wetter biomes or areas around the world that are hotter and wetter are going to have the most biodiversity. For a number of different atmospheric reasons that we're going to get into when we talk about atmospheres later on in the course, the equatorial region around the world is going to be the hottest and receive the highest amount of rainfall of any place around the globe. So if you look at different places around the equator, so Central and South America, right in the middle of Africa, and right in around Indonesia, these are all going to be the places that have the hottest conditions and the wettest conditions. These are going to be your areas that have tropical rainforests, for example, and so species diversity is going to be higher right around that equator. Now, conversely, going backwards, the driest areas and the coldest areas around the planet are going to have the lowest biodiversity. That's going to be your poles. Remember how I said that Antarctica is actually the world's biggest desert because deserts are based on rainfall. So polar regions receive the fewest amount of precipitation of any place in the globe, and they also tend to be the coldest places on the globe. So polar regions will have the lowest biodiversity. And in addition, species diversity is also not equally distributed among all groups of animals or biological organisms on the planet. In fact, insects overwhelmingly have the highest number of species of any animal group. Beetles alone, which account for around 40% of the insect class, outnumber the non-insect species of every other type of animal combined. So insects have an enormous contribution to species diversity around the planet. Now, that is everything I have for you guys for the introduction to biodiversity. Can't wait to talk to you guys about the benefits of biodiversity, which will be in the next lecture. I'll talk to you guys then.